Hello, everyone, and welcome to the newest episode of the Unbox the Soap podcast on queer ecology, based on a tutorial that we did under the supervision of Maria Setinic that talked broadly about queer ecologies and whether it is possible for us to talk about queer ecology. I think the most interesting questions that we were covering or tried to answer was how can we connect the incommensurable, meaning that we are all interested in the antisocial theory that comes from the Lacanian psychoanalytic movement that treats with the other desire and loss and is on the side of negativity and negating the social order. We wanted to somehow connect it with the theories that seem to be more affirmative and materialist, that deal with the topic of environment and environmental crisis. And we wanted to see if it is possible to speak about environmental crisis from the queer perspective and whether it is possible to combine these two theories to speak of a certain way of being that is outside of the dominant order, that at the same time sides with nature and the natural, and whether it is possible to sit with this conflict. So together with Nia and RJ, welcome, we gathered to talk about objects that we brought that we think encapsulate this way of thinking that deals with both nature and being on the side of either negativity or just otherness or being outside the dominant structures. So I will be talking about the poetry of Zuzanna Ginczanka.
I am talking about a poem by Daisy Lafarge.
And I will be doing a close reading of a verse from a contemporary hip-hop piece by Menes the Pharoah.
So should we jump into it? How much her poetry speaks to me. Because in general, I have to say I often struggle with poetry in a way that I have to read it a couple of times to understand what the lyrical speaker is saying or what can I get out of the poem I am reading. But with her, it was the first time I experienced this, that I would just read her poetry and it would just hit the right spot and I would immediately it's not even about understanding, but I would immediately feel it and I would immediately connect with it in some way. And it's something that I had never experienced before I encountered her. That reading her just came with ease for me. And Zuzanna Ginczanka is a very interesting figure because right now she is considered to be one of the most important poets of the 20th century Poland. But it was not the case. She had been forgotten for most of the 20th century until the late 90s, I want to say, when she was uncovered by this one scholar. And she was the first one who started uncovering her poetry and bring back to the spotlight the fact that she, during the interwar period, was one of the most important figures in Polish poetry. And ever since,
Sorry, just to clarify, when you say most important figures in Polish poetry, being like in the contemporary sphere was lauded after and appreciated, or that simply, like, how subjective is this? Is like a historically founded importance where like all the other poets in that sphere were also like keeping up with her work? Or, sorry, just as a clarification.
Yeah, exactly that. Like, she was applauded for her poetry in the interwar period. She started writing very early, when apparently her first verses she composed at the age of 4 and her first poems at the age of 8, and she published her first work at 14. And she actually sent her poem, I think the one that she wrote at the age of 14, to this competition that was organized by one of the most famous Polish poets, Julian Tuwim, that like to this day is considered one of the most important Polish poets. And he was absolutely charmed by her poetry. And when she moved to Warsaw, to Warsaw, to study pedagogy in 1930s, she was already lauded as an important poet. She was called Tuwim in a dress. She actually was the only female member of Skamandryci, one of the most famous poetry groups in early 20th century Poland. But then she was completely forgotten about. She was murdered during Holocaust. And yeah, possibly one of the reasons why she was forgotten was because she was a woman. And because she was one of the few female poets, writers, artists that at the time received the same spotlight as men. But then it was very easy to just erase her from history. And I'm going to talk about this more because she was quote unquote different and queer in this way from others because she was also Jewish. So maybe I'll just start talking about it. Ginczanka was born on March 22nd, 1917 in Kyiv, and she was born to a Jewish family. Her parents escaped the Russian Civil War and settled in Ruvne, which was back then on the eastern border of Poland, and now it is Ukraine. However, she was mostly brought up by her grandmother, and she was brought up speaking Russian, but she chose to learn and speak Polish, and she did not know any Yiddish. And it was her conscious choice, actually, to become Polish, although until 1930s, she had a passport of a stateless person. She wasn't granted any national identity. And she is described as an elusive and eccentric figure that refused to be pinpointed. And there's this one poem that she wrote called Betrayal, which begins with this line, "No one will shackle me." And nowadays, this line, "no one will shackle me," became the metaphor or like metonymy for her own poetry because it's so hard to pinpoint her and so hard to try to put her in any like movement because her poetry is really outside the dominant framework or line of poetry and the poetic heritage that we have in Poland. She's somewhere on the margins. And to continue with her biography a little bit, she was known for being the eccentric figure, and also she was very much othered because of being a woman and being a Jew. There is, for example, this anecdote when in the 1930s there was this common slogan or like plan to resettle all Polish Jews to Madagascar. And there is an anecdote that she once attended a party dressed as if she was about to travel with a suitcase where it was written "to Madagascar." So she was always approaching this oppression with certain irony, and she was known to have been, sarcastic about her predicament. She approached it sarcastically. And she went into hiding in World War II, and she hid in Krakow until she was denounced and murdered. And her final poem, which is known by the first line, Non omnis moriar, is her most famous poem where she accuses those complicit in denouncing her, but also this accusation extends towards the Polish passivity, the myths and the structures that have allowed for the Holocaust to happen in the first place. So her poem cites as this biting mark on the Polish history and the Polish society that reminds us of also our own complicity in the Holocaust and the passivity and inacting in what Jewish people have experienced. And why did I choose her to talk about specifically for this podcast on queer ecology? First of all, I want to specify that what I understand by queerness, I follow both Edelman and Halberstam, although they mean a bit two different things, but I think they both agree that queerness is no longer about sexuality. For Halberstam, it is about the practices of living that are outside of the dominant ways of being, while for Edelman, it is just pure negation of the neoliberal order and of the kind of heterosexual futurity. And it is this empty space is not even filled with anything, it just negates the structure under which we live in. So this is what I understand by queerness. It is this difference and kind of embracing otherness. And when I was reading about Ginczanka, I was reading this article by Arashkiewicz and Kev, and they write that Ginczanka, after years of forgetfulness, comes back as a symbol of otherness. And I'm quoting here, "It is because there is a need to fit her in the Polish cultural space fully and integrally, with what she wrote with her life and fate, and how she summed up her Polish acultureness in her last poem. Her Jewish ancestry and cultural assimilation, which gave her in the patriarchal interwar Bohemia an ambivalent label of a quote-unquote beautiful Jewess, the poet articulated in her poems conscious sense of otherness, and how strong the thought and imagination flow from it, which could reformulate and reevaluate the status quo. And the strength of Ginczanka's poetry is her avant-garde, experimental lyricism, which is mostly focused on existential paths she crossed to. And here the authors quote her poem, "Find Herself Dispersed," which is also the poem that I am bringing to the table. And the authors also note, what I find very interesting is that she basically anticipated new materialism that rose to prominence in the 1990s. There is this interpretative framework that understands her poetry as coming up with a version of feminism that is very much connected with nature, that at the same time is way of thinking that is outside of the status quo that was prevalent in Poland at the time. And this, her vision of how this thought could take form is in her poem About Centaurs, which also is the name of the poetry book under which she published all of these poems. And there she imagines the figure of a centaur as both weaving the spiritual and the natural, that it has this masculine body that is the body of reason and that is the body of wisdom, and at the same time it's joined to the body of an animal, of passion and of certain embodiment that somehow translates into the reason. So already in 1930s she was talking about how these two are intertwined and cannot be separated, which I find very visionary for that times, knowing that the movement of new materialism came about only in the late 1990s, early 2000s. To have a poem like this, I think, is quite groundbreaking. I think I'm talking so much about Ginczanka's life because I consider her as a figure as reflecting on queerness and otherness, and especially because her untimely death when she was murdered during Holocaust, this to me is seen as this cut that forces us to be faced with loss and that continues to haunt us to this day with her poetry. That is the heritage that we are left with. And because of that, if we see not only her poetry but her as a figure that produced that poetry, we can see how this otherness and this loss is sided with nature and is sided with the unspeakable and the impossible to conceptualize, which is the Holocaust. So I think that here, reading this poetry through the context of her life and her being a woman, a Jew, becomes important to further consider how we can do queer ecologies. But the poem I actually brought here that I want to talk about is called Explanation in the Margins. And this is a poem that I think, once again, I find it crazy that she wrote it in 1930s. I think she wrote it being only 19. And this poem to me could be considered certain new materialist manifesto, but at the same time, if we look closely into it, I think there is something very queer about it that also is in connection to what we discussed during the tutorial. So maybe let me read it first and then I can analyze it. Explanation in the Margins. I did not arise from the dust. I will not return to dust. I have not come down from the sky, and I will not go back to heaven. I am heaven herself, just like a vitric ceiling. I am earth herself, just like fertile soil. I did not escape from anywhere, and I will not return there. Apart from myself, I don't know another distance. In the bloated lung of the wind and in the calcification of crags, I must myself here find dispersed. So what I find interesting about this poem is already this certain attunement to nature and the natural that goes beyond the nature culture binaries, which right now by this point is a bit of a worn out phrase, but back then it was still a very much settled binary. And yeah, the poem begins with a play on the Bible, and it relates to the Ash Wednesday, where we are being reminded that we are made from dust and that we will also return to dust. But the poem begins with her negating that. What I find interesting in this poem is this negation that continues to be manifested, that I did not arise from the dust, I will not return, I have not come down, I will not go back, and I did not escape. How I see it is that this way the lyrical speaker embraces the negation and decides to sit in the conflict and sit with certain loss that comes with rejecting what is being imposed, and then try to see what can happen when this takes place. Here I'm thinking of what Nicole Seymour in Strange Natures wrote, that I'm quoting, "If queer theory has taught us anything, it's to be skeptical of claims to authentic identities and by extension authentic sites, especially considering how queerness been maligned as the artificial, urban, and non-reproductive foil of authentic, vital heterosexuality." So I think here, precisely through negation, the lyrical speaker is rejecting any identity that is being imposed on her, but at the same time, she seems to be saying who she is instead. But if we look closely, actually, she avoids any other identity rather than just the broadly understood natural, because she says that I am heaven herself, I am earth herself, just like fertile soil or a vitric ceiling, but then these don't really mean anything rather than just being, as the last word says, dispersed. So it seems like the lyrical speaker prefers to be dispersed across rather than having any holistic sense of self. This way, through this dispersal, I believe that the lyrical speaker positions herself as the other, as the speaker that finds shelter in certain ecological thinking, but at the same time fails to embrace any other new identity, but rather sit with this dispersal. And when reading that poem, I was also thinking of what Swarbrick argues when it comes to his criticism of eco-critical thinking, that, I'm quoting, "Although poetic materialism does not promise life or futurity, it offers something else, dare I say something better, the encounter with a disastrous materiality that undoes the imperative to survive. At stake in this argument are the pleasures that result from repeating loss." And to build on that argument, Swarbrick quotes Sappho, that in her poetry, Sappho constantly delays the desire with the word now again in Carson's translation. And I think Ginczanka in this poem does something very similar in constantly delaying the ability to define herself and rather sitting with the struggle of being at loss with who she is. And I think that this is something that we can learn from when we think of ecology and the way we think of nature. That I think, like, one argument that Swarbrick brings to the table that I find very convincing is that with new materialism, we begin to ascribe materiality to words. And because of that, we continue to treat the material through the humanistic lens that hides some meaning in it. While I think that this poem here delays that meaning and rather decides to just observe how the self is scattered around and shatters itself into different material aspects without wishing to reconcile with the wholeness, because eventually, as the poem ends, I must myself here find dispersed. It doesn't say that I must find myself whole, but rather dispersed, and embrace the fact that the identity will never be full. And this is reflected also in this other poem called Betrayal that I talked about before, where she talks about how nobody will be able to catch her because she will always change her shapes. She will become this animal and that animal, and then she will become Mercury all of a sudden, and she will continue flowing until nobody will be able to catch her. So this is once again this constant escapism from labels and from being able to be defined as something that she actually finds in nature. So I would say that this poem is also against trying to seek definition, but rather sitting with the struggle.
Sure. I think for me, this attention to dispersal and incompleteness, it reminds me a lot of, and I know you're referencing Swarbrick, who has voiced his critiques of the new materialist and OO schools of thought, this sort of ontological turn that happens in the 2010s. But it does remind me, I think, intensely, this poem, I think precisely because of that sort of new materialist edge to it, of two side-by-side thoughts that Timothy Morton of the object-oriented ontology school, following up on the work of Graham Harman but bringing it into an ecological, ethical framework, voices at two different points. So the first is from an essay on queer ecologies, and Morton says, all life forms, along with the environments they compose and inhabit, defy boundaries between the inside and outside at every level. And this is part of a larger concept called subsendence, this idea that not only are beings constantly in flux because of being in a state of being smaller on the outside than they are on the inside, basically being comprised of more ontological components than the ontological component that they comprise, that this generates a sensation of being, essentially dispersed, that the boundary between the body and sort of what lies outside it, and consequently, when scaled up to the biosphere, what lies inside and outside the city, what comprises like human culture, becomes increasingly hard to differentiate, becomes very indistinct. Ambiguous not necessarily meaning unknowable, but meaning undecided, either way, good enough, as it were. And in conjunction with this theory of subsendence, Morton proposes this idea of the perforated world, or not a perforated world singular, but perforated worlds, that worlds form more of a interlink. There isn't just one, there are multiple, but that the experience of world, which is not just restricted to the human, is this notion that on account of the multiplicitous human and non-human ways of accessing material, and the ways in which these can never exhaust the reality of that material, that there's always something in object-oriented ontology that is withdrawn. This is the concept of withdrawal. And I think this is, for the sort of irreconcilability that is proposed between psychoanalysis and object-oriented ontology, I do think this concept of withdrawal is very, very proximate to the idea of Lacanian lack, and I do think that there are more envoys that can be made in that direction, or what is the image of the other that cannot be assumed, that cannot be, truly known, recognized, projected into. And because of these sort of multiplicitous ways of accessing the material, what Morton calls the symbiotic real, that what is initially framed as one world with a defined and delineated boundary, or even a set of worlds with defined and delineated boundaries, are no longer capable of withstanding their own weight. They become perforated, enmeshed, they imbricate, and these boundaries, which were hitherto considered rigid, become fuzzy, blurry, increasingly overlapping, a delta mixing between a riverbed and an ocean, this sort of brackish water that lies in between, not quite fresh, not quite salty. And this points of transition, this perforation marking points of transition. And I think that this dispersal in the poem, and also the sort of the patience with which it is finally deployed, being the last line in this poem, that it takes quite a while to get there, shows exactly this sort of duration of transfer, this offsetting, this delay, this, I'm trying to find the word that you used exactly, but precisely this idea of something that is offset just a little bit longer, that is never quite allowed to be reached.
I think this precise gap that you just mentioned, or the gesture towards it, towards the end, I find that in the last part of the poem, when the line that starts with "apart from myself, I don't know another distance," this "apart from myself" really took me a little aback, and I'm still not sure quite exactly what it means, in the sense that I am, with the final part of "I must myself here find dispersed," but then before that it is "apart from myself, I don't know another distance." So there is still this really weird and I think very productive way of the shadowing of the self, and maybe, the gesture towards the Lacanian gap that I'm not sure how to bridge exactly. I really enjoy that kind of, it's very mushy, it's very open.
Yeah, I think knowing her other works, what she very often does is she takes certain archetypes, either biblical archetypes or mythological ones or from literature, and she basically deconstructs them. And that takes many different forms. When she, for example, redefines a certain character and establishes a feminist version of one, or she ironizes something that is very much cherished in the Polish literary heritage. Like, she does different things with it, but here I think what she does is that she basically deconstructs the kind of biblical order of understanding ourselves as these spiritual beings that have this duality. And I think this is most visible in the lines that I will quote: "I have not come down from the sky and I will not go back to heaven. I am heaven herself, just like a vitric ceiling," is the moment where she pushes this opposition and starts to construct something, but something that is based on irony and making fun of the imposed ways of being, because the heaven that she talks about is a heaven of a ceiling. It's something that is not pompous the way the Christian heaven would be. This is the moment where the rest of the poem is taking a radical stance, positionality. The only things that can be known are the things that can be experienced or felt, but then you cannot really share that knowledge with anybody else, so you just have to experience it for yourself. And I think in this way she also opens up for the plurality of knowledges. And now I'm thinking of another text. It's Ortega's text on carnalities, and about how here the text kind of becomes the punctum that pierces you bodily and breaks the boundaries that you built around yourself and punctures your sense of being with the text, and kind of forces you to reconfigure the way you identify yourself with and how you orient yourself also carnally in the space. So this is how I see the line "apart from myself, I don't know any other distance," because this is retaking the agency to build your own codes and structures that, for her at least, lie in this way of being dispersed and in avoiding any way of definitions.
Yeah, to build on the carnalities text by Ortega, there's a quote by Anzaldúa, I think, that talks about the body, mind, soul, and that's her concept of the self that she uses in it, which I think fits perfectly. Like, the body, mind, soul is the sort of shattered and incomplete, but in that complete self connected to the earth.
Yeah, nice. Should we move on to another object?
Maybe I can pick up. The object that I'm bringing is actually a verse from a hip-hop. Yeah, it's from a hip-hop track by an artist named Menes the Pharoah, who produces and raps for a label called Basement Dwellers. It's not actually his verse, it's a feature on the track from a vocalist called p.Wrecks. p.Wrecks is a Washington-based rapper. He's popular in the underground scene in that locale, but this isn't his main career, and he only shows up once every half decade. Previous work of his sort of focused mainly on madness, which is why I think it's maybe good to do this transition off of that anecdote about craziness. Previously did an album with post-hardcore vocalist Corey Lockwood called First Place Science Project, which sort of explores this split state of mania. In this song, some of those themes are brought back. It's a leitmotif in his work and clearly inspires sort of the grounding of what he does. But in this particular album, on this track, it's the third track in the fourth album of a series of 4 albums produced between 2019 and 2020, so right during the COVID year, of course, or the first of many COVID years. And these were a series of 4 albums based on the seasons, named summer, fall, winter, and spring, respectively. And spring is the final one. And they deal with a number of, representational issues of identity, of eco-crisis, race and sex politics from a variety of perspectives. Yeah, I'm not sure what else there is to add. It might be good to play the track then first. So the name of the track is Impest, the archaic form of the word Impest. It's an archaic form of the word pest, so to inflict with pestilence or to inflict oneself as if a pestilence or a contagion or a disease. Pestilence, of course, being one of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. So this song already, with its eco-critical attentiveness, it's pessimistic, it's heavily foreboding. It is about the apocalypse. It is about the Armageddon, climate Armageddon. But I think I'll just play it then, and we can get to it from there.
Sapphires and charcoal that turn to diamonds when pressure applying. Forever devised in isolation at my location. 100 steps outside, you died as seasons changing.
Journal reduction, unearth and secluded compass. Everyone's ideally that little boy in a bubble. Taught form, strategic monolith rubble. Caustic formula assembled to cause trouble. Tried excavation in every other way possible. Terraform, falsehood, crumpled, handmade paper spacecraft. Floor used up cans, head full of several hells. Shovel fell with the last shovel full. The song is rope, the void's vastness implored. Entropy, misanthrope, antelope stag. Easily broke the trance like slate my doctrines rock. Flood the flood, fed it myself. Beaming escape pod, padded, maintain fall mid-maneuver. Pulling from a vision like couldn't quite pinpoint. Make a theory irrelevant as easily as it's portrayed visceral. Portrait of a leaky faucet in a decorated gold leaf frame. Humans rhyme with excuses. Evacuate, containment, never enough. Obstacles piled towards the tree line. Smells of burnt plastic offering. Sold the magic feather to the tragic author and its quoted soundscapes torn into fragments.
Radiation underground and in the sky. Animals and birds who live nearby are dying.
It's infectious lyricism, I'll say, in theme with the title. And I think there are all sorts of really wonderful avenues that one can trace out from here. Some that I will introduce but allow you guys to explore maybe in the discussion section. All 3 of these artists are white men. None of them are openly queer. Only one of them, p.Wrecks, who of course has done previous work in mad sound, identifies as being a mad artist. And so as far as like identity politics might be concerned, yeah, these guys, it would be weird to talk about these guys in terms of a queer ecology without acknowledging the fact that they're not overtly queer in the traditional understanding of sexuality. Now, of course, with the last poem, we've talked specifically about this queerness as not being purely associated with sexuality or even orientation, so much as it is a particular ghosting or being ghosted by a normative system. I suppose like a disavowal, a refusal. Lee Edelman has a quote that I pulled up, but that, he highlights the negativity of the queer to refuse the insistence of hope itself as affirmation, which is always affirmation of an order whose refusal will still register as unthinkable, irresponsible, inhumane. Essentially, that affirmation finds itself as a, not coherence, but a compliance with a system which doesn't recognize its own impossibility. That there are certain exigencies that are recognized as exigent, but from which are constantly being extracted to maintain the system's perception of itself. This is this irreplaceable lack between the queer subject and the normative subject. So I think that's point of interest, is this identities of the three vocalists, but also what they're like, the perspectives from which they're singing. Menes the Pharoah in that first verse highlighting and focusing on this affluent in culture, very hip with it, very obsessed in a way with the superficial, with the social, what is immediately visible and tangible and not extigent. Everything from this sort of attentiveness to, and now I really wish I had printed out all of their lyrics. Perhaps we'll put a pin in that for now. Then we have like White Lotus come in, this this sauntering rhyme scheme, very militant, essentially an admission that there is something at fault, but almost this latching into this phantasm. What's easiest to blame? This is where we get this sort of course, with the history of it being a COVID era track, this sort of vaccine denialism, vaccination, be lucky if we can't escape it. And then we have p.Wrecks come in, who from the very beginning is lodged his lyricism in the material, and in specifically this acknowledgement of extraction from what is supposedly extigent, this unearthing of the secluded, the ideal of being this quote-unquote little boy in the bubble, trying excavation in every other way possible first. And at the same time, attentiveness to essentially what is the climate Armageddon, everything from flooding the flood, these ideas of scale, of mass apocalyptic natural disasters, and also in sort of true Lee Edelman fashion, following this no future apocalyptic theorizing. Lee Edelman's new book being, of course, about, bad education, why queer theory teaches us nothing. This pulling from a visual I couldn't quite pinpoint, make a theory irrelevant as easily as it is portrayed visceral, portrait of a leaky faucet in a decorated gold leaf frame. We're talking about exactly this idea of, even in the way that we are approaching these ideas of negativity, even in an attentiveness to the material, we're missing out on something, which is that we're only able to frame it again in terms of our human language. So this is like a lack within the way that we're talking about the material. And there's this sort of queerness that is attained in this, frankly, nihilism for me.
What you were just talking about now made me think of the fact that once you touch something with the symbolic order, you will never be able to see it outside of the symbolic order. It will always be the symbolic. And we will never access nature in that sense. It will always have some meaning to us because we live in the symbolic, and therefore we will not be able to look at outside of language. So that was what I was thinking of when we were just talking about your object.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is definitely something to be said about that inaccessibility, and for me, why it then does reaffirm what new materialism, or at least object-oriented ontology, offers for eco-theory. No, but it's precisely this idea of the withdrawal of the symbiotic real, of the material, of the object, that I think pulls the pressure off, the theorist, maybe. I don't know, this is something I would need to think through a little bit more.
On the thing about the theorist, I find it interesting that at the end they sing. So the last 3 lines go, smells of burnt plastic offerings, sold the magic feather to the tragic author, and its quilted soundscapes turn into fragments. I don't know, I find it interesting. But also the thing about that you said about the theorist earlier, I wasn't too clear on that.
I mean, if I could respond to the last 3 lines that you mentioned, because they also strangely remind me of the poem I brought, the quilted soundscapes torn into fragments. Once again, we have the dispersal here, but then I was thinking also of the fact that it is a rap song, so it's a very particular context, because when it comes to songs in general, this is my personal experience, but specifically with rap songs, also not being a native English speaker, very often when I listen to these songs, I no longer focus on the meaning, but rather I just go with it, go with the flow. And because of that, the words no longer even for me try to embody or give meaning to something. They just become sounds together with other instruments that are playing. So I was thinking how could we relate this with this idea of dispersal, but also with what you were talking about in terms of language and in terms of ecology and in terms of facing this lack that hides behind new materialism. What can songs, specifically rap songs, bring into the table, and what can we engage with? What can be at play or at stake when it comes to this conversation here?
Yeah, Nia, to answer your question first, what I'm saying about the theorist, the pressure being off the theorist, is that in acknowledging the withdrawal of objects and the perforated worlds that these, by virtue of that withdrawal, generate, that if a world is understood to be a fragmentary phenomenology of access of an individual, say like a human or even of a non-human animal, or Timothy Morton uses, for instance, a waterfall on a rock, right? Like the way in which these two entities access each other is in very different ways. And it doesn't have to be intentional. It can be sort of an algorithmic state of existing that generates this world and generates these particular appearances, which are then accessed by others. And so what I mean to say is that when it's off the theorist, it's to say that the acknowledgement of a perforated world, to try and maybe relate this a little bit to like decolonial theory, is an acknowledgement of positionality and of the relations of those positions. It's to say that there is not a sovereign, there's not a sovereign or hegemonic way of accessing the world that is more correct or more real per se than others. This isn't to say that all means of accessing the world are the same. Like I think we can agree that like access through extraction is much more damaging and much more harmful than accessing through even like picking up a flower off the ground, or even accessing through looking at a flower. Yeah, relationality. Let's go. But no, like this is what I mean by it's off the theorist. To bring it into the sonic material, Franek, I do have some notes on this myself. So I think it's really interesting what you say about, especially being with rap as a non-native speaker, that it returns back into the sonic. And I think it's important to note that sound is material. It's vibrational matter, and it has very material consequences, even if what it carries is a symbolic or representational element of what the lyrics are. We've talked briefly about the lyrics, but I think to hone in on specifically this line, which I think is very promising, flood the flood, this idea of a scaled up environmental disaster, that even this large-scale environmental disaster can somehow itself be victim to itself or to another of itself, to me is very reminiscent of Timothy Morton's notion of hyperobjects, and these objects which are so widely dispersed and so constantly felt that we're no longer able to point to them or give them a form. So for instance, like climate being something that we can talk about loosely and that we can represent through data, but that when it really comes down to it, we will point to something like weather, which is a way in which we access climate or a way in which climate expresses itself. Or we point to global warming, which itself is a smaller scale hyperobject that we can point to in the form of like ice caps melting or polar bears gradually going extinct. But these are only expressions of this hyperobject. And these hyperobjects are very viscous, and they generate with them a lot of eco-trauma, is the term that Timothy Morton uses, and I'm sure that it's borrowed from somewhere else, but I'm unfortunately only well-read on Morton because I have autism and a hyperfixation. To follow up with the specific idea of flooding the flood, I want to work with the idea of the wave and how it figures on three levels: the representational, the structural, and the material, and how this might relate to queerness. We talked briefly about like fluidity with the poems. But yeah, so initially in the material sense, there's the sound wave, the actual sort of vibrational amplitude which interacts with the subject, but it interacts differently with the subject. Like our ears don't receive the same sounds in the same way, not even down to the way that they're wired to our brains, based on the way that sound reverberates inside the cochlea, which is this snail-shaped membrane inside our ear. And what the cochlea does is it removes certain sounds from the sound wave that comes into the ear, is sort of chopped into pieces and then recognized in smaller components, and those components themselves are rendered incomplete. They're made in a way to lack certain data. So this is already a way in which sort of the perforated world can be made clear between humans. But moreover, that the musical sample, that even if we're not talking about the voice of the speaker, but the sample which is being looped underneath them, where that's concerned, it's also treated as malleable, fluid material that is chopped and brought back together at certain points. That even in the sort of jaunty or abrupt skipping of the end of the loop into the beginning of the loop, that this can in itself, through repetition, become somewhat wave-like in an ebb and flow manner. And this to me being an interesting way to look at the material component of it. And then on the structural side, what the wave can do to the notion of boundaries. I did a Timothy Morton quote earlier about the impossibility to define boundaries and where the outside and inside lies, or at the very least to define them strictly. And I think that the wave is a very good example of this. I used the analogy of brackish water in a delta earlier, but we can also think about what it does on the coast, how it, with the tides, a coast gradually is eroded or carried out to sea, that there are interactions between the wave and the supposed boundary of the territory that are constantly reshaping those boundaries, and indeed like merging into those boundaries in a way that, decentralizes. I think the wave is, as far as this poem is concerned, an excellent way of decentering the human, of doing this sort of always already queer project of rejecting this anthropocentric, which is by default already a colonial and heteronormative way of viewing what constitutes the human. Way of viewing the environment. I think something that's interesting to say about the use specifically of this sort of like mad drawl, which on the level of the sort of representational / material, that like these lyrics spill almost like a wave out of the confines of the measure and into the next one, so that it almost feels like this continuous broiling, unrolling process that never is quite finished. That is, I think, like we've seen with Franek's poetic example, features the same type of apprehension, but more like this use of what I think Jurelle Bruce would call mad time, this sort of metaphysical offbeat, the spilling of one's temporality out of sync with capitalist time, which Bruce proposes as this critical supplement, quote unquote, to queer time. It offers potential for reading the experience of time in a sort of Anthropocene context and in a climate Armageddon context, but also, of course, this is supplementary to queer time, and I think it offers many insights without necessarily offering the exact same theorization to a queer time. One thing to note here, Bruce's theory of mad time is universalizing, one might say, that sort of follows this standard structure of my theorization, or like this time in a puritanical sense offers the solution to XYZ, capitalism, transnational racism, coloniality, etc. And in doing such, kind of doesn't afford readings of madness that have been co-opted into these larger frameworks of whiteness, not even just whiteness, but like of race, of sexuality, of productivity, capitalist productivity, and the way that these are so continuously, harnessed by like the attention economy, for instance, the way that like my madness as a person with autism and ADHD and probably some other things is wielded against me by like truly addictive forces like social media, like the institution in which we study, and so on and so forth. So I want to follow up on Guess Who, Timothy Morton, when they highlight that when we talk about time, we're not talking about time, we're talking about the measurement of time. And specifically, we're talking about temporality, the ality of which this suffix always has to do with a way of accessing. So it's, again, this sort of question of withdrawal, of lack, of failure to access the real, this real which in some way may catch up, as it were, after the fact in the form of eco-trauma. And so when we talk then also about the mad time of p.Wrecks's vocal delivery, we're talking also about the way in which these representational rhythms, these waves, as I've framed them, are offering a very brief thrownness into the being of that temporality. We're not necessarily becoming mad subjects through this vocal delivery, as it is, as it were, lets us in on the secret of that madness, of that eco-trauma. Much in the same way that, like, as a white mad subject, p.Wrecks, living also in the US, in Washington, would have been one of the later people to actually feel the brunt of climate change. So this is a thing that, even in 2020, being let in on, it's not a new thing. This is something that gradually, the scope of the queerness, of the madness of, is an ever-widening network, as it were. All right. Should we move on to the last object?
Okay. Hi. My poem is from a poetry collection called Life Without Air by Daisy Lafarge. It came out in 2020, so again, very COVID. And it is about toxicity, so it was very topical when it came out, even though it was written before that. The title of the poetry collection comes from a sort of take on Louis Pasteur's quote when he observed the fermentation and made penicillin. But yeah, it was when saying that while most organisms perished from lack of air, some were able to thrive as life without air. So it's a very, fungal way of looking at life. And what is interesting about the entirety of the collection is its attention to language, because it is very elemental and molecular, and yeah, it's a very particular way of writing. The poems themselves take many forms. Some of them are more prose-like, while others are very short, like 4 to 6 lines. Some of them are a nod to a classical ode, like an ancient Greek. A poem called The Batu Lake, which is named after a lake in Mongolia, which is known for its extraction of metals and particles used in the manufacturing of phones or other electrical devices that led to the contamination of the surroundings of the lake. And that one is split into a few parts that take a different look on toxicity. Another one of the longer poems looks at toxic gas. So each of the 7, I think, parts focuses on a different type of a toxic gas and sort of poetically interprets or intervenes in them. Anyway, I don't know much about her. I don't even remember how I found the poetry collection, but I've been continuously coming back to it and keep finding new things in the poems. I think, yeah, it's a very interesting object and I highly recommend. Anyway, so the poem that I chose is called Dog Rose Duende, and it is a little bit long. It is separated into 4 sections, and I will read it out. So, Dog Rose Duende. Like all asymmetrical creatures, we love from a lack of alternatives. And since a home can be made of any old ware, I might have lived forever in your bedroom drawer, becoming obedient as you were to the god of dirigible wounds and ink pots, ecstatic with thumbs stuck in yellow and blue, disbelieving in color while recipes got rained down for dinner. Really, we had to eat the lists, and after the rain, whole heads of eglantine who peered from the hedges with faces of bread. You can ingest a word to check on its edges, but might not be able to stop to see if an organ's metabolic harmony is just a deal it has struck between the viscerous sibling rivalries. And so we learn to laugh at appalling separation because it isn't true, because dead heads grow back after a season of salt grit and an excision or two. This was the dance in your mouth and mine, a house cleaved in two at the end of a love when neither could bear to look at the other, and so turned to stitch up the membrane between, diaphanous castle that love led to siege, laid then a new wall and doppelganger stairs, which already narrow, they could only descend, twinned in the updraft of ruthless impressions or listening ears turned to the wind. Yeah, so it's pretty long, and the more you read it or pay attention to the language, you see the sort of elementality that I mentioned earlier. It's a lot of flower language, in particular with this one. An eglantine or eglantine, I did check how it is pronounced and I immediately forgot, is a type of a rosebud. It's the part that it blooms. And a deadhead is, again, it could be the sort of bud that is taken away and repotted, I believe. So yeah. So from the beginning, I really enjoyed the first two lines. Like all asymmetrical creatures, we love from a lack of alternatives. It's interesting. It does this move towards, like all creatures, although asymmetrical is quite an interesting way to put it. We love from a lack of alternatives calls for a little bit of a Lacanian reading. There is lack. But I did wanted to turn it more towards not that much of a negative read and a rather productive, like positive reading. And I want to go back to Swarbrick, who takes the ecological subject as a subject that cannot get over and a subject that cannot surpass or entangle the obscene jouissance as its core, since the core of enjoyment paradoxically sustains the ecological subject as a breach or a tear. I think this way of love and lack tied together is central to the concept of jouissance. And what Swarbrick prescribes is, again, using jouissance as a reparative form, and that is Tim Dean at the end of Lacan on queerness and queer theory, Lacan and queer theory, is that the pleasure principle needs to be central to queer theory as a mode of working. What did you think about the poem? I think that the end really works well with the first poem that Franek brought, especially with the turn to the wind. Yeah, wind is mentioned in both, and that kind of stuck to me when you were reading it out in the beginning.
Yeah, I think formally there's something interesting to be said about the fact that it opens with this line about, asymmetrical creatures, and then that the poem itself is near symmetrical, but not quite, that it's split into, as Nia introduced, 4 sections. The first one is 12 lines, second is 5, third is 5, and then the fourth is 13 lines. So it's almost this promise that's unfulfilled which is fulfilled actually, like we have to wait till the final line to actually, in a way, affirm the asymmetry of the poem, that it's something that's been stated, and then we must be apprehensive of. I just thought that was an interesting thing maybe to point out formally about this. I'm not sure how it may relate to lack, but maybe someone else can pick up off of me on that.
I mean, what I am interested in, and it's something that you, RJ, also, you looked at me when Nia was reading it, is this verse: you can ingest the word to check on its edges, but might not be able to stop to see if an organ's metabolic harmony is just the deal it has struck between the viscera's sibling rivalries. And I don't know, I find like this idea of chewing on a word, something that we are talking about before, like this conflict between the word and the natural, which can be translated into the conflict between the symbolic and the real, and whether poetry could be a possible access beyond the symbolic, because it uses text and words in such a way that questions the way we typically use language, because what I think what this poem does it confuses, and that's what I like about it, is that I don't know what she means by this verse. You can ingest, but then she's talking about the rivalry between the organs, but what are the sibling organs and stuff like this, and it just makes me like, there are some images that are in my head, but I don't know what to do with these images. And I think this is what is inherent in terms of the antisocial and the queer, right? That just uses the language to, once again, have this prolongment and this...
No, it makes sense to me. And I think that picking up off of that, I think this comes down to then again questions of access and who's accessing and what is being accessed and how does it appear, coming back to object-oriented ontology. This is, for me, this idea of, that you were prompting this idea of whether poetry can access this, again, I'm going to go with Timothy Morton's definition, symbiotic real, this idea of some environment which includes us that may be there, but that we cannot quite access, and that poetry may give us a way of doing that. And I think to the extent that, like, language is an object, and I think this is something which is maybe not often remembered in more traditional critiques of, like, object-oriented ontology, is that, like, objects aren't always material in the traditional sense of being a solid or molecular, but that, like, sound vibrations, thoughts, words do have this sort of, like, tactile, haptic quality of the object, of an object. And this is precisely why we can say things like chew on a word and get what that means on a sort of effective level. For this, I think it might be a good segue to go back to something that I broached briefly about the segue between our last two objects, which is this idea of madness as a potential form of queering and as an attentiveness to a particular sort of experience that is non-exhaustive of the object, but is more clearly diverse, more clearly distinguished from a normative approach to things. And I think that, for me, what's interesting about this poem, Nia's poem, the one by Daisy Lafarge, is that it feels on many levels, and I do not use this term lightly, it's not meant in its sort of demeaning way, like a word salad, like this sort of Deleuzian, like, schizobabble, bringing together these supposedly disparate ideas of relations and presenting them on a platter that sort of spins around in front of us and that we have to get a gauge of, and that it is ultimately showing to us the ways in which we can't get a gauge of it. It makes clear precisely the failure that's inherent to a lot of the ways we talk about both queerness and environment, that are subterraneous, that exist in the discourse, but that we're not aware of until they're made aware. And I think poetry is a way of pointing to that failure of access, which is intrinsic to it. I think Lee Edelman has a passage on that, but I'm happy to pass this along to someone else.
I think it's Warbrick, as Franek mentioned in the beginning, that has this insistence on poetry's adaptability or use in theory. And in a quote in the introduction, he says that encircling endlessly around ciphered objects, these poets that he analyzes in his introduction, but in our case, our poets, reveal that loss is central to the enjoyment poetry offers and that nature offers. They offer readers an environmental poetics in which loss is not the obstacle to desire, but its aim. So this kind of, a little bit of confusion creates a gap to be able to think about something different, or to orient yourself around the poem differently and the way that it's structured, the language that it uses. In the third stanza, the beginning is very weird, and so we have to laugh at appalling separation, this kind of inability. The way that I would read it is an inability to reach the other, or that which has been othered. In the beginning of the conclusion of her book, Strange Nature, Seymour argues that queer literature is environmental literature for how it grapples with the natural. And I think in that way, the Lafarge poem does exactly that. It's this repetition or return or insistence on the natural that stitches the poem together and holds all of the metaphors together. So the idea of strange natures, as the term that Seymour coins, is supposed to both demonstrate that and explain how the skepticism of natural categories can coexist with sincere investment in the natural world. And again, in this way, the poem really plays with that, both with the how and the demonstration aspect of it. Because, what I keep returning to, this insistence on very particular language that is not necessarily legible or easily accessible, does something.
What I find interesting is that I feel like what the prevalent theme in this poem is that there is a human need and attempt to do something, of making a home, of trying to digest, or just having to laugh about something that doesn't make sense. Simultaneously, almost parallelly, there is just nature doing nature and just really not caring at all about what we try to understand, what we try to make sense out of. Because throughout the whole poem, you have these certain reminders that the flowers will grow again, that the membranes will make themselves, that the organs will digest whatever they want to digest, and that everything is just gonna continue working and having this certain order that we will never be able to decipher and we will never be able to fully understand. And we can try all we want with language and with inventing metaphors or new archetypes or new myth, but to be fair, all of our attempts are utterly ignored by the natural order, which will just continue to exist. And this is what I think this poem is playing with or making fun of, this constant attempt to access it, to access the inaccessible, basically.
That was great.
Thank you so much, guys, for ruminating together, meditating on the things that we have been learning, and possibly thank you for staying confused together with everything that we have tried to understand, but then reaching the conclusion, but sometimes maybe it's okay not to understand the environment and nature. And thank you, listeners, for interacting with the lack together and with the loss that overwhelms us, but hopefully together we could make something out of it. And if not, that you could listen to some nice poetry and a nice rap song.
Thank you, Franek, for hosting us on the podcast. It was a pleasure to be on and to conclude our 2 months worth of studying queer ecologies with this. Perhaps there's a little bit of confusion remaining, but isn't there always with psychoanalysis? Thank you. It was a pleasure to be on.
Thank you as well. It was fun. I had never done a podcast before, so it was a fun thing to try. Lovely objects.
Thank you so much for listening. Make sure to like and subscribe our podcast and stay tuned for the next episodes. We're going to follow with an interview with Steven Swarbrick that we have referenced here a bunch of times. So stay tuned for that. And we are smoothly transitioning into the anticipated launch of our 7th Soapbox issue of the Soapbox Journal, which will be followed by interviews with the authors, so stay tuned.
I don't get it. Sub-thoughts, strong guard attention, ventilation, putting your chest like space helmets. Ain't telling, long hauling cage felon, like a Tina, with the dick like a beamer, investing in the end like the last world leader. EP to LP, lastly to firstly, strictly about the business, mask on no mercy.